Good afternoon, everyone. Before starting my speech, I would like to acknowledge Professor Claire Bright, João Pedro Guimarães, Didier Reynders, who will join us by video message, Vera Paquette Perdigão, our distinguished guests, Odete Severino Soares, the chair for the panel on business and children's rights, and the scientific and organizing committee of the conference. It is my pleasure to be one of the people delivering the opening speeches on the first annual conference on business, human rights, and sustainability, organized by the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. We are very grateful to our sponsors, the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and Industry and PLMJ, and to our partners, Nova for the Globe and SEDIS. My name is Dussu Djabula, and I am currently a research assistant at the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment, and president of HeForShe Lisbon. I couldn't make this introductory speech without first referencing and applauding the people who are still willing to exercise their right to protest, to make their voices heard, especially young people who have been leading protests and also creating true movements to contribute to a more just and equal world. When I say this, I think of Greta Thunberg, I think of José Kizola, Vanessa Nakati, and many others. The goal of my introductory speech today is to discuss climate change and human rights through an intersectional lens. This particular theme is of utmost importance, and this has been brought even further to the spotlight with COP26, but also with alarming data that shows how climate change is one of the leading causes of the aggravation of food insecurity. Currently, one third of the world's population faces food insecurity. While COP26 was taking place, much was said and even criticized. Many share the belief that COP26 was never meant to be successful. There are many reasons to state that indeed COP26 was a failure. However, there is still much to be done, and there is still much that was decided at this conference. 40 countries pledged to phase out coal, the most polluting fossil fuel, and members of this pledge include heavy coal users. Richer countries said they would phase it out in the 2030s, with poorer countries committing to the 2040s. Many world leaders agreed on a UK-led plan to accelerate affordable and clean technology worldwide by 2030, and 45 countries have pledged to take urgent action to make farming more sustainable. Although these commitments are important, they focus on reducing our carbon footprint, and little to no discussion has been had about the implications that climate change will have on human rights. Climate change and human rights for a long time have been treated as separate issues. However, I challenge you today not to see it as separate, but rather as intrinsically connected. Given the fact that most have already accepted the inevitability of climate change, I suggest that now we start having meaningful discussions about what does climate change mean to some groups of people, and how commitments made during and after COP26 might not be capable to address the complexity of the issue. Kimberly Crenshaw, the professor who coined the term intersectionality, defines it as a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. Intersectionality can and should be an overarching concept, an idea that when applied to all of our societal issues, such as climate change, enables us to reach solutions that don't leave behind the most marginalized groups of people. In my brief intervention, I would like to explore the intersection between climate change, race, and gender. It is clear to me that we cannot advocate against climate change without also advocating for the people who would be the most affected in the event of a potential reckless phasing out of fossil fuels. As one activist has put it, with the arrival of slavery comes a repurposing of the land, chopping down of trees, disrupting water systems and other ecological systems. Racial injustice and climate change are deeply connected, which is what activists such as Elizabeth Jean-Pierre have dedicated much of their life to explore and study. Climate change and racial injustice share the same roots, so they must be addressed together. Climate change is the result of a legacy of extraction, of colonialism, of slavery that helped create and propel what we now see as the greatest danger to human existence. Because of this, it's not surprising that climate change, as the current COVID-19 pandemic, disproportional has affected Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, which I will now reference as BIPOC. BIPOC are the most vulnerable to having flooded homes, vanishing sources of drinking water, disrupted local economies, and extreme heat waves. Wealthy people will and are already adapting to climate change, while poor and disadvantaged people have less ability to do so. And this inequality has a racial dimension, which is made clear by the current racial race gap. To put this into perspective, recent work done by the think tank German Watch found that the 10 countries most threatened by climate change are in the global south, and that corresponds to the countries that were in the past colonized. Now I want to dedicate some of my time to address the intersection between climate change and gender. There is most definitely a gender dimension to this big issue, which has been recently confirmed by the IPCC. Climate change affects harshly women and girls, since it's likely to put them in dangerous situations where they are most exposed to violence. A report done by CARE shows that 1 out of 5 women who are refugees or have been displaced because of natural disasters have experienced sexual violence. And as if this data isn't alarming enough, there is also a real risk of death of women and girls who are often seen as caregivers. So in the case of floodings and other natural disasters, women and girls are expected to stay back and protect other members of their families. And in some countries, they are not even allowed to leave their home without the permission of a man. In addition, girls at a young age, such as 12, can be forced into marriages as a coping mechanism. After natural disasters, the most affected families see young girls as a burden. So in these families, child marriage is seen as their only option, through which they can, on one hand, reduce the family's economic burden, and on the other hand, actually make sure that this girl is taken care of. And to illustrate this phenomenon even better, in Malawi, climate change could create 1.5 million additional child brides in the coming years. All of this puts into perspective what a just transition could mean. We should look at the outcomes, but also at the process through which we reach carbon neutral, and the way public and corporate policies are designed to combat climate change. To have this just transition, we should have an intersectional perspective, so that when those decisions are made, there is someone in the room asking, how does this policy affect women and girls? And how does this policy affect BIPOC? The current commitments made only set to reduce the impact of climate change, and they don't seek to eliminate and avoid completely climate change. If we are going to accept that we cannot avoid climate change, then all decisions must be intersectional, so that specific groups of people, such as women, girls, and BIPOC, aren't an afterthought and are thoroughly considered in every step of the process. Setting targets and creating process without an intersectional lens, I would argue, is worthless. We have the future of a whole generation in our hands, and this is an enormous responsibility. This is about doing what is right in the right way. The future starts with the work done in the present. So I hope we can start today building a safe and sustainable future for everyone. Many thanks for listening to me. And before passing the floor to everyone that is going to speak at this webinar, we would like to show you a video that was created by the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment and Bianchetti.
Don't look away. No, don't turn your eyes away. Instead, keep them wide open. Listen carefully. Let us start with climate change and the environment. In the era of sustainability, the world remains unsustainable. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. The climate crisis threatens to undo the last 50 years of progress in development, global health, and poverty reduction, and to further widen existing health inequities between and within populations. Meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement could save about 1 million lives a year worldwide by 2050 through reductions in air pollution alone. Pollution, which is fueled by unsustainable consumption and production, is generating an estimated 1 in 6 of all premature deaths. Now let's talk about labor conditions and children. The International Labor Organization estimates that some 2.3 million women and men around the world succumb to work-related accidents or diseases every year. Forced labor still persists in 2021, and we have to keep on talking about it until each single person is safe. But we are far from this goal. And we encourage that with our consumption habits, 1 in 5 cotton products worldwide produced is linked to forced labor in China. According to Unicef, the number of children in child labor has risen to 160 million globally. That's almost 1 in 10 children. It has actually worsened in recent years with an increase of 8.4 million children in the last 4 years.
I want to challenge you to join me in taking our relationship to a still higher level. I propose that you, the business leaders here gathered in Davos, and we, the United Nations, initiate a global compact of shared values and principles which will give a human face to the global market.
In the EU, only 1/3 of companies are estimated to have human rights and environmental due diligence in place, and the majority of these are limited to first-tier suppliers. In Portugal, the first national inquiry on responsible business conduct and human rights, conducted in 2018, revealed that less than 1 in 5 companies have human rights due diligence processes in place. There is hope. We hear its voice on the streets. We hear the voice of the younger generations. It's a cry for help. It's a call for action. Our action. Leaders, each one of us, individuals, humans.
So has the video actually ended with the quote of John Ruggie, "There's still much to be done." So it is my pleasure to present and pass the floor to João Pedro Guimarães, Secretary General of the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who will tell us more what the Chamber does and the partnership with the Center.
Thank you very much, Dussu, and congratulations on your speech. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for us at the CCIP, the Portuguese Chamber for Commerce and Industry, to support and be part of this initiative and this conference. Our aim today is, of course, to share knowledge, to promote and to reflect of the importance, above all, of respect for human rights and business, and within this context, on the various challenges that companies face over this particular subject. These themes are absolutely in line with the purpose of the CCIP. For those of you who don't know, we are a private business association that supports Portuguese companies since 1834, and that seeks to promote the development of our members both at national and international level. So we have a wide network of members throughout the country and also abroad, from different economic sectors of activity, and we work daily to enhance their growth. We are a key partner as well and promoter of our members' internationalization, promoting synergies between SMEs and large companies. And throughout these more than 187 years of history, our chambers of commerce has always been guided by the principles of respect and safeguarding of human rights. We do it daily, of course, in our activities with our companies, but also at the institutional level through the relationship that we maintain with public authorities, chiefly among them the Portuguese government. One of our main worries has been, as expressed very often through the work and words of our president, has been employee wages. And the CCIP has been paramount in defending what has been called the fair and dignified salary, a concept that connects the wages with productivity and which should surpass the concept of a minimum wage. We also defend measures that prevent what we've been calling social dumping, or any kind of measure that aims at increasing profits at the expense of human rights, opting for production, for instance, in countries where these are not respected, and not forgetting the distortions this practice promotes at the economic and competition levels. So we believe that economic development and human rights are intertwined. They are intertwined, they cannot be dissociated. And we are sure that initiatives like this one are fundamental for guaranteeing this purpose, shedding light over issues that cannot be forgotten. And this is the reason, the main reason why we have partnered with the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. We believe in the importance of their work, and of course, we believe in the importance of our own. So we believe that we can be stronger together. Being so, in addition to supporting this conference, we also be partners as well in other activities in the future and other areas, helping as well to share information concretely in what regards now 4 relevant papers on the subject, 2 that we hope will be released later on this year, one of them hopefully very soon, that can be accessible as well in our website. And this is almost all for now. Just a quick word to finish, saying that we at the CCIP work to be helpful and useful to companies, of course, to the economy, to our country, but above all to people. In the end, there's always people. So we believe that they are the main objective of our activity. And if we can help to enhance their rights, we will be fulfilling our reason to exist. Just before we started, we're talking here among ourselves, among the group of people that will speak here, and we said that business without human rights has no future. And this is the reason that we will work together with the Nova Center for Business and Human Rights and the Environment, and we believe that this is the way to go. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
Many thanks for your speech, João Pedro. Business indeed cannot survive without human rights. And now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Claire Bright. She is an assistant professor at Nova School of Law and the founder and director of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. Her intervention will address business, human rights and sustainability, challenges and opportunities.
Thank you very much, Dussu. Thank you, João Pedro, and thank you to all the distinguished panelists and experts that have accepted to be with us today. Good afternoon, everyone. I also wanted to thank the team of students that have been helping with the organization of this event, as well as the members of the scientific committee of this conference. And of course, I would like to extend a very warm thanks to our partners, PNMJ and the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and Industry for their trust and their support. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. And I would have liked to do it in person, But with the COVID situation, we felt that it would be wiser to do it online. As Dussu mentioned in my presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the challenges and opportunities of business, human rights, and sustainability. At the moment, we hear a lot about sustainability and the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental. A lot of emphasis has been placed lately on the environmental dimension, and that is probably linked to the increase of regulation in the field. I am thinking about the European Green Deal, the Green Taxonomy, the EU pledge to be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050, and the recently adopted EU climate law, which writes this goal into law. And of course, this emphasis is very important, as climate change is accelerating and has serious implications on human rights, as we've heard earlier from Dussu. And in fact, on the 8th of October this year, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution which recognized for the first time that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. However, something that is often overlooked in the discussions on climate change is that climate mitigation and adaptation measures can too have implications for the human rights of workers and local communities. In this event, we would like to focus on the social pillar of of sustainable development, which of course encapsulates human rights, and which is also, sadly, the weaker pillar. That is the pillar where most efforts need to be done. Development cannot be sustainable if respect for human rights is not at the heart of it. In fact, the preamble of the UN Sustainable Development Goals affirms that the 70 goals and 169 targets seek to realize the human rights of all. I mentioned earlier that I would speak about the challenges and opportunities in my presentations of business, human rights, and sustainability. So let me start with the challenges. Companies can be involved in adverse human rights impact in a variety of ways. From the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, which caused the death of thousands of workers working in unsafe conditions in factories supplying European and international brands, to widespread use of child labor in the cocoa farms in West Africa supplying chocolate companies, to issues of forced labor in the cotton industry in China and Uzbekistan, to issues of pollution and climate-related impacts resulting from mining and oil exploration activities in South Africa or South America, affecting the livelihoods of local and indigenous communities. The examples, unfortunately, are numerous. But human rights issues arising out of business activities do not just happen in remote locations of the so-called global south. They are also common in the so-called global north. Reported examples include issues of discrimination, precarious employment of workers in the hospitality sector, for instance, and in the gig economy, the working conditions of migrant workers in the agricultural sector, to name just a few examples. And these issues have been aggravated by the COVID-19 crisis, and we will have the opportunity to discuss those in more details in the various panels. In these regards, companies can play a crucial role in ensuring the respect for human rights as well as environmental standards in their activities, but also throughout their global supply chains. In 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council. They are a soft law instrument in the sense that they are not legally binding, but their legitimacy and influence comes from the broad consensus that they created. And as I talk about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, I want to take time to mention John Ruggie, the author of the UN Guiding Principles, who passed away recently. He's sadly missed, but his legacy, especially in the field of business and human rights, will live on. Core to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which arises out of social expectations and require companies to have, in particular, a human rights due diligence process in place, which is a process to become aware of the adverse human rights impacts that they can have or be connected to, but also to address them. The good news is that a number of companies have shown leadership and adopted human rights due diligence processes, which are becoming more robust. The bad news, there are many laggards. In the study that I co-authored for the European Commission on due diligence requirements through the supply chain, only just 1/3 of business respondents indicated that their companies undertake due diligence, taking into account all human rights and environmental impacts. And the majority of those indicated that their due diligence exercise was limited to first-tier suppliers, which is problematic because quite often human rights issues are to be found further down the supply chain. We heard earlier that here in Portugal, it's estimated that less than 1 in 5 companies have due diligence processes in place. In the European Commission study, we found that the main incentives at the moment for companies to exercise human rights due diligence were the reputational risks, the pressure from investors, and the pressure from consumers requiring a higher standards. But the regulatory pressure is increasing. And now I'm coming to the opportunities part of my presentation. Important legislative developments are taking place at the European level. What we see in relation to the regulatory landscape is that there is a growing number of countries adopting or considering the adoption of legislative measures encouraging or requiring companies to exercise human rights due diligence. Some of them include reporting requirements aiming to encourage companies to exercise human rights due diligence. We have, for instance, the example of the UK Modern Slavery Act, adopted in 2015, which requires large companies doing business in the UK to publish an annual statement of the steps that they are taking to ensure that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in any of their activities or any of their supply chains. But we also have more recently legislation that go beyond mere reporting requirements to actually require companies to undertake substantive human rights due diligence. Some of them are specific to certain issues, like the Dutch Child Labour Due Diligence Act adopted in 2019 and not yet entered into force, which requires companies selling goods or services onto the Dutch market to exercise due diligence in relation to the risk of child labour being used in their supply chains. We also have legislations that are more overarching. The pioneer in this respect was the French duty of vigilance law adopted in 2017, which requires large French companies to effectively implement and publish a plan de vigilance, a vigilance plan setting out the due diligence measures taken in relation to the company's own activities, but also in relation to their established business relationships. Earlier this year, 2 new laws were adopted in Norway and in Germany, requiring companies to exercise human rights due diligence as well. So we can see the momentum is increasing. There is a growing number of countries that are adopting laws. And the question is now, where are we at the European level? In our study for the European Commission, the majority of stakeholders supported the introduction of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence at the European level. It was very much perceived as the regulatory option which would yield the greatest positive social, environmental, and human rights impacts. And nearly 70% of the companies that we surveyed anticipated that it would be beneficial for business, in the sense that it would provide a uniform standard at the EU level rather than fragmented approaches at the national level, thereby increasing legal certainty, but that it would also level the playing field. So the momentum for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is growing. Regulatory change is coming. Last year, the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, who we will hear in a moment, announced the European Commission's commitment to introduce a law that would make it binding for companies to exercise human rights and environmental due diligence. In March this year, the European Parliament adopted a resolution with recommendations to the European Commission in this respect. I am pleased to report that we're now waiting for the text of the European Commission, and I'm pleased to report that Didier Reynders will tell us a little bit more in his video message about it in a few minutes. To conclude, I would just like to say that I believe this is an opportunity for companies, not just to endure the regulatory changes, but to get ahead of the regulatory wave and show leadership in terms of sustainable development through the implementation of robust human rights and environmental due diligence processes. Again, I would like to thank all our speakers, all of participants, all the audience, and everyone who has helped make this conference happen today. And I wish you all a fruitful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire, for speaking on the issues and also speaking on the opportunities. And now, on that note, I would take this opportunity to present our chair for this first panel of this annual conference. Our chair, Odete Severino Soares. Odete Severino Soares is a senior social policy advisor in the Ministry of Labour, Solidarity and Social Security in Portugal, and an expert in human rights and children's rights. Currently, she's a master's student in social and innovation law at Nova School of Law and the executive coordinator of the new advanced studies in children's rights program of Nova School of Law. Also, she is an individual member of both the international organization Child and the national organization Child Support Institute. Odete, the floor is yours. Odete, you should turn your mic on.
Thank you, Dussu. Hello, I welcome everyone to our first webinar today dedicated to business and children's rights. We have a very interesting session for you all and are lucky to be joined by EU Commissioner for Justice Didier Reynders by a video message, the Hello Director Vera Paquette Perdigão, John Morrison, Maria Pia Bianchetti, and Tuli Kabonsal. Thank you all. I don't know, just for information, the European Parliament member, Marisa Matias, who is in our program, cannot be here today because she is now attending the plenary session in European Parliament in Strasbourg, which she regrets not taking part in our discussion today. This webinar will focus on the issue of the mandatory human rights and the environment due diligence. Where do children's rights fit? Very, very important questions to answer today. This initiative is part of the first annual conference on business and human rights organized by NOVA, Knowledge Center for Business, Human Rights and Environment, in partnership with the PLMJ and Environment and the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as well as NOVA for the Globe. This annual conference begins today till tomorrow with a wide and interesting range of topics to be discussed along these 2 days. Before giving the floor to our guest speakers, I would like to inform our audience that after the presentations, we will finish this webinar with the live question and answers with all the speakers. Please use the chat box to put your questions during the session. Without further delay, we are going to watch the video message sent by the European Commission for Justice, Didier Reynders. He could not be able to participate in the webinar today, but he sent an important message for our discussion, and we are going to watch it right now. Claire, please.
Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to open this webinar on due diligence and children's rights. All EU policies and actions having an impact on children must consider their rights and their best interests. And it's my responsibility in the Commission to oversee this. Our work to protect children's rights is guided by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which all EU member states have ratified. And the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights is our legal basis. The Rights of the Child component of the EU Charter is very strong, and it prohibits child labor. Earlier this year, the Commission adopted the EU strategy on the rights of the child, renewing our commitment to combat forced labor as a priority. We are also committed to promoting the protection of victims of business-related abuses and the ratification and effective implementation of ILO fundamental conventions. That is why I will soon table a proposal to set EU-wide binding due diligence rules for global supply chains. I believe that legally binding measures are necessary to address the complex problems in the supply chains with regard to adverse impacts on the environment and on human rights. Voluntary initiatives simply do not work. The proposal will oblige companies to identify, address, and remedy harm to both human rights and the environment throughout their value chain. To create a level playing field, all EU businesses and non-EU companies generating important turnover in the internal market will have to apply the rules. But it's not just about ensuring economic fairness in the EU single market. It is also about ensuring that every company contributes to protecting our common planet and human rights, including the rights of children. Children are vulnerable in the supply chain, especially lower down in sectors of concern such as agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. Indeed, the most flagrant violations of human rights, such as forced or child labor, often happen further down the value chain, beyond the EU's border. There is evidence of young children working for long hours scavenging for rocks containing cobalt for our smartphones, or children working in hazardous conditions for the cocoa that we eat and drink. Children who are forced to work and robbed of their childhood. They are robbed of their right to an education, which deprives them of opportunities later in life. Children who are forced to work often take on much bigger responsibilities. They have to provide for their families while enduring hard, unhealthy, and often dangerous working conditions. EU leadership, both in the EU and globally, can make a difference. What we are looking at are common EU rules addressing risks of worst forms of child labor across the value chains. In line with international standards, these rules will oblige companies to identify, mitigate, or prevent possible harm linked to their own operations, their products and services, and the entirety of their upstream and downstream value chains. The initiative will build on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and its due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. It will also clarify the duty of company directors to manage sustainability risks related to the impact of companies' activities on the environment and stakeholders. I believe that these tools and measures would strengthen the protection of the human rights of all stakeholders throughout a company's value chain. This includes, in particular, a better protection of children. It is a chance for the European Union to transition to a much-needed business model that is fairer and more sustainable and lead to a world in sustainable corporate governance. I hope you enjoy the webinar and wish you a fruitful debate.
So it is indeed a very important message from the Commission, Didier Reynders. After many years of insisting on voluntary measures, the Commission has finally understood the urgent need to better protection of human rights and environment. Now let me introduce our next keynote speaker, Vera Paquette Perdigão. She is the Director of the Governance and Tripartism Department at the International Labour Organization, ILO. Vera is an economist with a Master on Economic Development and Enterprise Management. Prior to joining the ILO, she led a career in developed at both national and international level for almost 20 years. She has an extensive experience in economic development, child labor, project management, poverty reduction, and gender issue. But before giving Vera Paquette Perdigão the floor, let me highlight that according to a new report by the International Labour Organization and UNICEF, the number of children in child labor has risen to 160 million worldwide, an increase of 8.4 million children in the last 4 years, with a risk of getting worse with the impact of the COVID-19. The UN has declared 2021 as the International Year of Elimination of Child Labor, which will provide an opportunity to address the challenge posed by COVID-19 and to accelerate the progress toward the goal set by SDG target 8.7 to end child labor in all its forms to 2025. Now I will give the floor to Vera Paquette Perdigão, and I would like to thank her for being with us today. Vera, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you again for this invitation or opportunity that is given to the ILO to address this event. I was following with very much interest all the speech, in particular also the fact the movie that was presented, which said almost everything I was supposed to be saying, looking at the issues related to child labor. But let me stress, as you said, that this year we published our joint publication with Unicef on child labor. And unfortunately, since 20 years ago, we've been publishing this report, we found out that we have an increase on child labor. Yes, indeed, we had a raise of 8.4 million since last estimation. And what is sad is that those estimations were done before COVID-19, which that means that we may be facing a very catastrophic situation in the coming years. Indeed, we have 79 million children, nearly half of those in child labor, in hazardous work that endangers the health and safety and morals, and 70% of these children are in agriculture. And I hear what the commissioner was saying about chocolates and things. where children may be engaged. And this is something that we'll be looking into it for many years in the ILO, identifying that whether small family farms are producing for substances or supply chain, they need more and adequate income and social service to allow them to keep the children free from child labor and children at school. So we definitely need investments in rural development if we want to make this as a priority. As you indicate, we are looking at this year, or International Year of Elimination of Child Labor, ahead of the 2025, which was set by the SDGs. We also look at the children's rights, and education is adversely affected. So 20% of the children between the range of the age of 5 to 11 years old and 35% of 12 to 14 years old are in child labor or out of school. And this is a damaging prospect for decent work, and especially also for youth and adults as we move on. Child labor in between the range of 5 to 11 age group went by 16.8 million since 2016, to 6.8 of whom were in adult work. Some good news is that the child labor continued to trend downwards for children in the range of 12 to 14 and the range of 15 to 17. But what is alarming is that we have an increase on the numbers of younger children. Looking also in this report, we found out that we have regional disparities and differences. In Asia and Pacific and Latin America and Caribbean regions, the child labor started to decrease. But unfortunately for Africa, in particular, sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen a different story, with child labor rising by 16.6 million. So 1.5% increase that we observed. And this continues upward that we had observed in 2012. We had a down decrease. We've been seeing an increase of the child labor. This divergent trend should be setting our alarms ringing, and we cannot accept that while some areas see steady gains, children in other regions are left behind. And so there is much at stake, and children whose education is cut off or short not have a path to decent jobs. And you know that the issue about having a virtual circle instead of a vicious circle, so you can have children that can access to education so they can have access to decent jobs when they'll be adults. So we had in a pivotal moment a year that we reached universal ratification of Convention 182, which is the convention about the worst form of child labor. So today, all children in the world are covered and should benefit from legal protection. And this is something that we must also try to put on that. Now, looking at the COVID-19. At the same time, we are confronted with COVID-19 and widespread of school closure and loss of livelihood from COVID-19 pandemic. A year and a half of the pandemic, and children everywhere have been seeing their education interrupted. We estimate that 117 million are affected by school closure. In this school closure, we also observe that there's a digital divide. It's true that in the global north, many children probably have access to school, digital, using the old technology. But in the global south, we observe that access is not as we expect. So even before the crisis, we had some third of the world, the youngest people, were already digital excluded. And with the COVID-19, we saw it even worsening the situation. And here I would like to pose a little bit about the situation of girls. girls are being seen the most affected, and there's emerging evidence that during school closures, girls have had less access to online learning compared to boys. So in this perspective, we also think that even when schools open, some girls not going back to school, they may be left behind. So with the perspective we have also is that the child labor is predicted to be on rise for further 8.9 million by the end of 2022. So 3 years before the deadline that we're supposed to be reaching the elimination of child labor. But this is not inevitable, if countries increase social protection coverage, we can reduce child labor by more than 50 million by the end of the next year. But on the other hand, if the governments continue cutting their spending on social protection from current levels, which are over 46 million additional children will be entering to child labor by the end of 2022. So now looking at the child labor in global supply chains, which is the specific of this conference. A recent report on child labor and forced labor and human trafficking in global supply chain that was published in 2019 by the ILO, OECD, IOM, and Unicef had stressed that while child labor is far more likely to take place in domestic economies, there is considerable part of its linkage to global supply chain. The worst labor condition and risks of violations of fundamental principles of rights at work, including child labor, occur most often in the lower tier of the supply chain. Among those in child labor, the percentage in global supply chain varies across region again. We have 20% in Eastern and Southern Asia, 20% in the Latin America and Caribbean, 12% in Central and Southern Asia, 12% in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 9% in North Africa and Western Asia. These reports have shown that child labor is a problem affecting the whole of the global supply chain, and that a significant share of child labor occurs in the upstream segments in the production of raw material and other inputs to final export product. It also tends to occur where downstream enterprises have the least visibility and leverage. A whole supply chain approach is therefore needed in terms of cooperation among governments, business, employers, and workers' organizations, and create what we call, from the ILO perspective, a social dialogue. So what is the due diligence? And I saw that the Commissioner has spoken about that the EU is planning to launch. The due diligence in child labor in recent years, a growing number of governments have introduced indeed supply chain transparency and due diligence legislation. And some countries have adopted or consider adopting such a regulation. It is relatively recent phenomenon, so the effectiveness of such a legislation is contributing to reducing child labor and other labor rights violations has not yet been systematically evaluated. And I think the Commission was saying going by different paths may not be effective, indeed. Nevertheless, legislations have increased in awareness among business, above all among senior business leaders. And in some cases, it has catalyzed more actions to prevent and address risks, including collaboration with stakeholders, legislation, and in major consumer markets can be driven by the change, by increasing government awareness and action in produced countries. I would like to conclude to say that in this International Year of the Elimination of Child Labor, as giving us the value opportunity to set up an action against child labor. Countries have established strong legal frameworks and integrated child labor concerns into education, sector plans, and social protection programs, and adopted the national action plans. And in May 2022, next year in South Africa the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor, where ILO constituents would come together to renew commitments and strengthen collaboration to reverse the trend and regain momentum towards the elimination of child labor. Business definitely can help drive the agenda, not only by generating decent jobs, but by ensuring that their operations and supply chains, children's rights to be free from child labor is respected. This means that clear policies against child labor, effective due diligence, transparency, fair business practice, and support for remediation is needed, if is needed. Transparency also along the supply chain is vital. Our call is for a renewed, concerted, and coordinated effort to tackle the root cause of child labor. Partnerships and coordination mechanisms are essential in this regard. And in this regard, we are with the Secretary of the Alliance 8.7, a global multi-stakeholder partnership established to meet and reach the SDG 8.7 on child labor and forced labor, and offers an invaluable forum to accelerate action, conduct research, and share knowledge, drive innovation, and leverage resources. Global challenges such as child labor and forced labor requires a global response. We do not have the luxury of spending resources on fragmented and uncoordinated action. Business can participate directly in the Islands 8.7 and work across sectors through the ILO Child Labor Platform to improve their due diligence process and work on the ground with industry peers to address child labor and child supply chain. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to address this event.
Thank you very much, Vera, for this interesting and enlightening presentation. Now, let me welcome our three next guest speakers, John Morrison, Maria Pia Bianchetti, and Tuli Kabonsal. Thank you for being with us today. I will propose now to give a more interactive session with John Morrison, Maria Pia Bianchetti, and Tuli Kabonsal. I will ask two questions to each speaker, who will have 5-7 minutes to answer each question. Before handing over to our three guest speakers, let me introduce them briefly. Our first speaker, Maria Pia Bianchetti, is a senior specialist in child rights and business at the UK Committee for Unicef, where she leads the policy and advocacy work of Unicef in UK, and on the impact of the business sector on child's rights, advocating for better legislation in the UK and business practice that respect children's rights. Among the areas of focus, there are mandatory human rights and environment due diligence in the UK, and climate justice and business. Then our second guest speaker, John Morrison. John is the CEO of the Institute of Human Rights and Business since its foundation in 2009. Currently, John also co-chairs the Human Rights Council of the World Economic Forum and participates on the advisory councils of the UK Export Credit Agency and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And finally, our third guest speaker, Tuli Kabonsal. Tuli is a senior advisor in the Human Rights and Business Department at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. For the last 10 years, she worked with business, national human rights commissions, and other stakeholders to promote human rights in the context of private sector. She has been leading the Danish Institute for Human Rights work on children's rights and business, an area she has been working since 2006. Without further delay, my first question goes to Maria Pia. Welcome, Maria, and thank you for being with us. My question is, why is it relevant to focus on children's rights in the discussion on business and human rights? Please, you have the floor. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Odete. Thank you for the floor. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for the invitation. I think I think one of the key reasons why it is important to focus on children's rights when we talk about business and human rights, and especially considering the initiatives that are being done in the sector in terms of legislation as well, is that you've seen it that a lot of previous speakers before me have talked about how voluntary actions are not working out, and this is because they're not bringing the change that we need at the scale and the speed that is necessary. And if we look at how our businesses have an impact on children's rights, we know that businesses have had a very wide impact on children's rights. UNICEF has done a lot of research and reports on how different sectors have an impact in different countries. But while there is a broad recognition that businesses have multiple effects on children's rights, and there is a recognition that children are among those categories that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights recognize as one of those categories that are at risk of marginalization and vulnerability. When it comes to the practice, especially the practice of environmental and human rights due diligence, children's rights are often overlooked. What we have seen is that there is a good understanding about child labor, an increase in business policies on child labor, but there is less focus on all the other aspects that businesses can look and can have an impact on children's rights. And anyway, those actions are not fully integrated, they are not part of the full strategy of businesses. So this is an issue because the risk is that some of those risks get often unnoticed and overlooked. So, child labor, previous speakers and panelists have talked about it already, so I will not get into that. But for example, childhood is a unique period of physical and mental development, and so harms to children during that period have impacts for the rest of their lives. So if we think about pollution and exposure to toxins of children, because of the size of their bodies, because their organs and their systems are still in development, children are more at risk of their health compared to adults when it comes to pollution and exposure to toxins as well. And so not addressing specifically and considering children as a group, as an independent stakeholder group in a business activities, means that often those impacts will go unnoticed because they will not be assessed and therefore they will not be addressed. Also, something that often goes unnoticed is how children might have an impact from the way that parents and caregivers are treated. So, for example, if parents or caregivers do not have decent labor policies in terms of allowing them, for example, of adequate parental leave, breastfeeding, children will also have an impact on that. So it is really important that that when we look at business and children's rights are recognized as an independent stakeholder group, that businesses need to take that into account, but also Dussu spoke about climate change, a COP26, children have an important voice, and that voice needs to be listened to, and they need to be part of the stakeholder engagement, part of those groups that are being listened to and that can inform the decisions.
Thank you, Maria Pia. Now I ask John. Thank you for being with us. John, I would like to ask you, what do the upcoming legislative developments on mandatory human rights due diligence at European level mean for children's rights?
Thank you, Odete. I'll answer the question in a slightly sort of a sideways way, I think, because Claire's covered a lot of that already. She set out the legislative agenda. I want to really address this issue of when does it make sense to see child rights as human rights as part of the broader sweep of things, and when does it make sense to pull it out and give it particular attention. I have to say that I really did enjoy to see Kofi Annan's face in the video, and I'm still in America. Actually, I was at John Ruggie's memorial at Harvard University on Saturday, as other people were as well. So certainly have John Ruggie in mind when making these remarks and the legacy of his work. I think there are three reasons why we need to keep child rights within the central canopy of business and human rights, and then I'll give reasons why we also need to give it particular attention. Intersectionality has already been mentioned. Biological age is clearly a differentiator, but so is class, race, gender, and other factors. And I think Dussu gave a very good opening rationale for why intersectionality has to be at the start of all of our analyses on business and human rights. And so child rights, I would say, needs to align with that too. Intergenerational rights. As those of us who were at COP26 2 or 3 weeks ago, discussions around climate justice, just transition, etc., already been mentioned. That isn't just about children, of course. It's generations yet to be born, and children become adults. So child rights have to position themselves within the discussion about intergenerational justice. And I think that's a complex thing, but it's an important thing. And the third reason for integration is integration. The three I's, then: intersectionality, intergenerationality, and integration. And I think we're seeing that in the European Union discussion, right? So, we're not talking about mandatory human rights due diligence. We're talking about mandatory climate, environmental, and human rights due diligence. So there's already this idea that human rights due diligence itself has to sit within ESG or some broader framework now, the methodology of which no one has yet. I'm very, very much looking forward to see the draft of how scopes 1, 2, and 3 on climate, for example, relate to the different categorizations we have in business and human rights. And also the other things in the EU, which we haven't mentioned, like the EU Financial Reporting Directive, etc. Again, putting business and human rights in that broader context. So those are all powerful reasons why child rights and business and human rights has to sit within the broader context. But I'll give you three quick, in my remaining couple of minutes, 3 quick reasons why, at least in my point of view, businesses should, certainly on occasions, look at child rights as a standalone. Earlier this year, we established the Center for Sport and Human Rights in Geneva as a separate organization. But while I was running the center, I did get to understand just how important child protection issues are in the world of sport. Children are the supply chain of sport, full stop, right? If you think about some sports like swimming and gymnastics, even at Olympic level, they are still children when they're competing. In most other sports, children reach world standard or national standard to become adult, but they're very young when they do that. And the number of cases around child abuse and coaches, Larry Nassar in the US in gymnastics being the most famous, but everywhere, Afghanistan, Haiti, revelations in China, of course, with an adult tennis player, but the child sexual abuse, intimidation, even murder, coercion is widespread within sport around the world. And I think if you think about sport as an industry, that should open all of our eyes, including in Europe. The second, the internet. We haven't mentioned child protection issues on the internet, grooming, but we've just been talking about the impact of COVID, mental health, eating disorders, a very serious upswing of child-related health impacts in relation to COVID all over the world. Another reason why we need standalone approach. And then the third has already been mentioned by our colleague at the ILO, the worst forms of child labor, of course, mining, agriculture, but also the intersection with child trafficking and child soldiers, etc. So I think, just to conclude, I think there are clearly times when we have to take a very specific child-focused approach to due diligence, but I don't think we should carve child rights out of the wider business and human rights approach at the EU or any other level. Thank you.
Before I give the floor to you, I would like to hear Maria P. again, because this question is very much related to John has just said. Maria, how to make sure that children's rights are adequately integrated in the mandatory due diligence legislation? As we know, voluntary action alone has failed to address the problem.
Sorry. I think it's, I think, the key is integration, right? Is making sure that as part of a wider approach, children's rights are integrated within the broader human rights and environmental due diligence piece of legislation. And Claire gave a broad overview of all the various initiatives that are happening. Obviously, the EU initiative is very significant, not only because of the size of the market that we're talking about, but also the influence that it will have in the future legislations, in influencing movements that will happen, but also the impact that will have on companies that, even if they're not headquartered in the EU, will want to be doing business in the EU single market. And last year, Unicef UK published a report highlighting why do we need this legislation as well in the UK, but also what would be key elements of a legislation on due diligence that make sure that children's rights are adequately integrated. I think one of the key issues that came out is that we need a comprehensive approach to human rights and environmental due diligence, because we need to look at things holistically, looking at the human rights aspects, but also the environmental aspects and how these are connected. So rather than instead taking a sector or a topic approach, children's rights impacts happen in an ecosystem of other impacts, and that is necessary to take that into consideration as well. So having definitely a broad approach on human rights, environmental due diligence, and also that puts together the environment and human rights is one way to be able to also address the broad spectrum that of children's rights that can be impacted by business activity. And definitely, as I was saying, taking children as stakeholders, consider them as one of the key stakeholders that businesses need to look into and address. So following the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, following the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, looking at specifically having businesses that need to give specific attention to certain groups, because we know that certain groups are more at risk of vulnerability and marginalization, and among these groups are children. And looking at children as independent stakeholders means really embedding it into the whole due diligence process. So it means from the impact assessment and prioritization assessment, looking at what would be, is there going to be a specific impact on children? Is the measure that businesses want to take to address this impact, does it take into account there might be children impacted, and what does it mean in terms of prioritization of issues for businesses to address? But it also looks at making sure that children and their legitimate representatives are part of the wider dialogue with companies, that their views are listened to in a safe and meaningful way, but they can also inform decisions that businesses take. But also it is necessary to avoid unintended consequences. So it is necessary that legislation on due diligence does not lead to having a thick box exercise, but also on having businesses looking more at approaches that are risk averse and rather on compliance only. So it is necessary that it drives the idea that businesses need to assess and address the root causes of those issues that they are dealing with. And also, going beyond tier one, you've heard it before me. That is where beyond tier one is where most of the impacts and the most serious impacts on children's rights will happen. So it is necessary that the legislation does not stop on tier one, and also looks at the whole business relationship. Is not only supply chains. Impacts on children can happen also because of the products that businesses put into the market, can happen in terms of activities. So it is necessary that it doesn't only, that it also looks at the complexity of businesses as well, and that obviously the standard of care is clarified for businesses, and it is based on international human rights framework, which also includes child rights. And obviously other things that might help this legislation to be truly effective is making sure that there is a meaningful disclosure requirement attached to it, enforcement mechanism, guidance for businesses on what it means adequate and effective due diligence in certain contexts and specific topics, and also access to justice is one key element of making sure that the legislation is effective as much as possible. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has always been clear that for rights to have meanings, effective remedies must be available to redress violation. And if any legislation on due diligence is going to be meaningful and effective, it needs also to have an access to justice element.
Thank you, Maria Pia. Just to remember that if you want to ask some questions to our speakers, please use the chat box, because we are going to have this opportunity at the end of this session. So now I'm asking, I'm giving the floor to Tulika and John, which is, I will ask the same question for both of them. And from a practical perspective, I want to ask first, what does it mean to implement human rights due diligence when it comes to children's rights? Second, can you give us a few examples from practice? And third, how to ensure that children have access to justice for the abuse of their rights by corporate entities, and how to remove any additional barriers that they face. I start with Tulika. Tulika, thank you for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Odete, for the introduction, and Claire for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here today with other speakers and panelists on this important topic. I think I'll be reiterating some of the issues already mentioned by other panelists. So you'll maybe hear some repetition, but I think that only confirms the importance of the topics. So in terms of human rights due diligence and what does it mean in terms of children's rights? So we all know that human rights due diligence consists of a number of steps, but we don't, I think, enough discuss and act upon what that means in practice. So what does it mean to conduct human rights due diligence with children's rights in mind? So I think you have to really think from the outset when implementing due diligence steps, what children's rights are and what it means to your business. So you have to see children as rights holders, as those that can be directly or indirectly impacted by your company or through your business relationships. And that applies to children from before they are born to when they reach adulthood. So think of the whole life of a child. Then, as also mentioned by Maria Pia and by John, we need to consider that children are differently impacted than adults. So they have different impacts when a business impacts an adult person than a children because of their physique. And we have to realize that some issues are relevant to children and some aren't. For example, as an extractives company, when you have security arrangements, they may affect children differently than adults. For example, children may be unknowingly trespassing an area when they're playing, which belongs to the company, and they can get in touch with security forces. But the company, if they haven't considered children's rights, they may not know how to deal with those children. We should also realize that as Maria Pia already mentioned, that the employees of a company are important actors when it comes to children's rights. So we have to think about excessive working hours, the availability of childcare, and if all that doesn't exist, how this affects not only the parents, but also the children. And I think, as has been mentioned before, child labor is, of course, a really important children's rights impact, which gets a lot of attention. For many companies, that is the only children's rights issue they consider. But companies should realize that there are so many other children's rights impacts to consider, and they should actually also identify, assess, and address those. When it comes to assessing and addressing children's rights impact, some companies have carried out dedicated children's rights impact assessments or impact assessments that have a particular focus on children's rights because it's an important topic for the company. So we have seen such assessments in the telecom sector, in the foods sector, and in the tourism sector. And when doing such assessments, it's important to bring in children's rights experts when doing those so that they can really help you as a company to understand how to engage with children and how to assess and address child rights. Also, when integrating and acting upon the findings of such an assessment, companies should ask themselves if the relevant functions within the company know enough about children's rights. Do they understand it? So, for example, a research and development team of a company, does it consider children's rights when designing a new product? Or does a marketing team understand what the relevant World Health Organization codes and resolutions are when it comes to infant formula? Companies can also decide to make formal commitments to children's rights, for example, in their existing human rights policies, or they could develop standalone policies, for example, on children's rights or marketing to children. And they could also consider integrating children's rights in surveys they conduct amongst their staff and in their annual risk assessments. And we should also not forget that transparency and reporting is extremely important. So companies should publish their efforts with regard to children's rights, such as their children's rights impact assessment reports or other efforts. I would also like to share maybe one or two examples of practice. So a few years ago, we conducted an impact assessment with an oil and gas company where we wanted to understand the potential risks and impacts of an exploration project. And we spoke, for this assessment, we spoke to community members, including adults, but also children. Adults pointed out certain concerns related to their land and crops and livelihoods. But when we spoke to the children, they came up with a complete other range of issues. They were concerned about their school. Would the school be affected if the company would come in? Or would the land where they used to play, would that be affected? Or would their water, the stream where they used to go swim, would that be affected? So this shows that children have different ideas of what the impacts are than their parents. And then lastly, I would also like to mention that we are seeing more and more impacts related to the use of technology and online activities. And this doesn't only apply to companies in the technology sector, but to every company that has an online presence. And these impacts have increased even more since the pandemic started, because more people, adults as well as children, are online. So here we have to think about things like cyberbullying, online exploitation, but also how children are depicted online in terms of race, size, age, etc. And these can all lead to discrimination, stigmatization, and other adverse impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, John. The same question.
Yes, and not to repeat what Tulika said. I mean, I agree I always agree with Tulika, so I agree again with her now. I had the pleasure of working with Tulika for many years in the context of Myanmar and the establishment of the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. So I just add, I suppose, the issue of conflict, you know, in situations like the one in which Myanmar is currently immersed. We must also think about enhanced due diligence based on humanitarian law and international criminal law, as well as international human rights law. And this issue about companies going into high-risk areas, but also pulling out of high-risk areas, the impact on children needs to be part of that enhanced due diligence as well. Sudan, and so let's not forget those environments too. I'll make just two very quick comments, just because no one has, and I'll just stir it up a little bit, because otherwise we just agree with each other the whole time, and it's interesting but to disagree a little bit. And I'm not disagreeing with anybody on the panel. I'm just putting another perspective forward. I mean, I think one of the things we haven't spoken about enough over the past 10 years of the UNGPs is economic, social, and cultural rights and business. For me at least, I think we spoke a lot more about that 10, 15 years ago, around health, and then when water became a human right. There is a particular issue around children, and as Tulika said, you know, children themselves might actually voice that water and healthy environment now that that's a human right as well. So make sure that the due diligence that you do doesn't just look at risk, but also looks at the fulfillment of rights or the absence of fulfillment of rights, even if that's a state duty. And this issue of businesses that perform public goods, right? We live in a world where in many parts of the world, it's not just the government that provides food, housing, education, and health and water. Businesses find themselves in the supply chain as well. And I think with climate change, particularly food, I mean, housing, resilience and adaptation, but all of these essential rights are going to be hugely disrupted by climate change, even if we stay at 1.5 degrees global warming. So I think a big plea for more attention on ESC rights. And then the second, just returning to this issue of intergenerational rights and intergenerational justice, that's different from child rights. And I think it's important we understand the difference. I mean, children are proxies. Greta Thunberg, for example, is a proxy, not just for the children of today, but also for the children of tomorrow, and the children in 100 years' time, and the children and adults in 200 years' time. You know, so children can be proxies for generations yet to come. But human rights is very bad at talking about the rights of people yet to be born, right? I mean, the legal focus of human rights is within the lifespan of an individual, with the exception of indigenous rights. Perhaps that's one area of human rights that's always had this intergenerational piece. So let's learn from indigenous rights and the work that's happening in, amongst jurists in Germany and in Wales. They have a commission on intergenerational rights. Some very interesting discussions going on about how we represent the rights of people generations yet to be born when making the decisions of today. And I think that's a real challenge for the human rights community to understand and be involved in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to recall that you can put your questions on the chat box. We have already one question, so feel free, because we want to a lively discussion at the end. My last question goes to Tulika, which is with COVID-19, a lot of audits have moved online. Are this type of virtual assessments fit to access children's rights? Tulika?
Thank you, Odete. This is, I think, a very timely question because as the pandemic hit us more than 1.5 years ago, all of a sudden companies had to change the way they conduct audits and assessments because they couldn't do these on the ground anymore. And many companies rely on in-person studies, assessments, audits, having people on the ground visiting the operations. Why is this important? Because we need to make sure that companies continue their processes of due diligence and assessing and addressing human rights and children's rights. But these types of virtual audits or assessments also come with a range of risks and limitations. So, for example, when it comes to child labor, this is a very hidden practice, and it's already challenging to uncover child labor and other children's rights impacts during an in-person assessment, as I've experienced myself. It's not something you just do 1, 2, 3 by speaking to 1 or 2 people. You need to build trust. You need to have face-to-face engagement. You need to build rapport with the workers, the parents, with other stakeholders to really understand the situation. You may need to speak to teachers, to others in the area who can shine some light on the issues related to children. And that is not something that you can replace through a video connection with a worker. Also, the use of technology brings a range of risks from a human rights perspective. For example, how can you be sure that no manager is looking over the shoulder of a worker that is being interviewed? How is the interview data being recorded and stored, and how can you ensure that that's not shared with those that should not have access to such data? And on the other hand, also, you can only do such virtual assessments during an announced visit because you need to prepare for it. So you also cannot come there unannounced. And these virtual assessments also only work for locations or sites that have a working internet connection, which also leads to accessibility issues and excluding probably certain people and sites from such an assessment. And then when it comes to child labor, it's also not really possible or straightforward to do things such as age verification and really see whether a child is underage or not when there is no face-to-face interaction. So these are just some of the issues that bring along the risks of such virtual assessments. But due diligence should continue. So what can be done to continue to assess human rights and children's rights during the pandemic and also in the future if people decide to travel less due to the climate emergency that we're facing? So my main message would be to work with local partners and community-based organizations on the ground instead of only relying on international service providers. Rely on the people that are already in country, organizations that have direct access and already have existing relationships with workers and their families, because they are best placed to detect what the situation currently is, how safe it is, how the situation has changed due to the pandemic, and they can report back and find solutions. Secondly, also rely on your own employees in your subsidiaries on the ground. So if you are multinational based in Europe, but have operations in Bangladesh or India or Africa or wherever, your people on the ground can be your eyes and ears as well. It's not the same as an independent third party, but they can shed light on some of the risks, impacts, and challenges. And lastly, companies should put increasing resources in identifying the root causes of children's rights impacts during the pandemic, but also normally, rather than putting excessive resources into audits. Audits are a snapshot in time, and they can help identify some issues at that very moment, but it's more important to identify root causes to then jointly with other industry actors address those.
Thank you, Felicia. Now, I would like, we finished this interactive session. We are going to open the floor for questions and answers for our audience. To our guest speakers, I have two questions on the Q&A, and I'm going to see. So we have one question from Dominique Schmitz. How could non-judicial grievance mechanism contribute to an effective remedy system for children? Who wants to start? I ask Maria Pia.
Sure. Thank you for the interesting question. And this is something that it is really important. I think, the access to justice aspect of it when it comes to children is still not really look at it properly. I think, one of the things that it is important to stress that obviously when it comes to access to justice for corporate abuses, victims have definitely quite a lot of barriers to face, generally speaking. The power imbalance between a community and a corporate actor is immense. When it comes to children specifically, they face also additionally barriers, which might mean, lack of information, physical distance from, the places where justice is administered, incurring costs and fees, but also, children are in a dependent status, which means that they depend on adults. They need to rely on adults to ensure that they have access to information, they are supported logistically, emotionally, financially, and when it comes to judicial-based mechanisms, in some they might not have the right to bring complaints on their own. So what makes a grievance mechanism child-friendly? It's looking at where are the barriers and making sure that the mechanisms are thought in a way, are designed in a way that truly allow meaningful participation for children, which means, from the ensuring that policies and codes of conduct have reference to the right standards, but also making sure that children and communities are part of the design of the mechanism, but also children should be allowed to bring complaints on their own or through a representative. But it also key is that the mechanism is accessible, that children have access to, they know the right, they know they can bring a complaint, they know how to bring a complaint, which means like they might need to have, ad hoc forms, they have accessible points, where can they go, can they access these mechanisms at all? And then also the mechanism itself needs to be fit for children to participate, so which goes from ensuring that privacy and confidentiality of children is respected, ensuring that they are treated with dignity and respect, so they can express their views and their views are taken into consideration, ensuring that those who administer this system are trained in children's rights and dealing with children and have expertise on that, but also making sure that there are people available to support children, but also looking at the outcomes and the remedy itself. It needs to be timely and prompt because, as we all said, like some of those impacts on children might create irreparable damage on their development, on their health, and on their rights. So in this case, remedies must be prompt and must be customized to children. So, for example, even considering interim measures, it is one way to make sure that you avoid further damage for children. And one of the things is that it is key is anyway, children should still be available, should still be allowed to bring complaints in front of judicial bodies. So that is one of the another key area.
Thank you, Maria P. I don't know if Tuli and John. Yes, John. Please.
Yeah, just to build on that. We had the case in London of Ella Adu Kissi Deborah, a 9-year-old who was killed basically by bad air pollution. And it took many, many years, even during her life and then after her death, for her mother to get justice and to get the recognition that it was pollution that killed her daughter. First case in the UK. And now that we have a human right for healthy environment, air, water, etc. It's not just about non-judicial grievance mechanisms. It's about judicial grievance too. And we mustn't forget that just a few years ago, some of the car companies were lying about their emissions of diesel vehicles. Volkswagen was one of them, right? They were lying about the emissions. There's the need for criminal sanctions against companies who have lied and are perhaps still lying around the toxic implications of emissions or byproducts, etc., that kill children around the world, and for firm legal justice, and remedy for the children before they die, right? Just on the non-judicial question, in sport, I'll go back to sport because I think FIFA has done some quite good work around child abuse in football and rapid response networks now that they've developed, and they have. I would single FIFA out for actually protecting children in countries like Afghanistan and Haiti, etc., when abuse at the hands of coaches. And remember, these coaches are powerful people. They're often close to the presidents and the prime ministers and the sports committees in these countries. So despite all the bad things FIFA, the reputation, I wish other sports bodies would do the same. And the IOC really is a long way behind FIFA in this issue of child protection in sport. We must intervene whenever there is an adult in a position of power over a child, and that adult isn't the official guardian or parent. We understand teachers have to be checked, and for some reason we think it's okay that our kids spend hours every day with coaches and others who only have the very thinnest of responsibility and accountability for the welfare of our children. So I think sport is an area that we all need to be pushing on. And if you're a business and you sponsor sport, you need to ask the sports that you're sponsoring whether they really have adequate child protection in place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to see the other question is from Rafael Oliveira. How to guarantee that the companies focus on other important children's rights issues aside from child labor, considering that number of companies are putting their efforts already on the prevention of child labor, how to tell the companies that even though they are doing a good effort, they must do more and focus on other relevant aspects of children's rights, which are not limited to child labor. I don't know if Vera is with us, is still with us. No. Tulika, do you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to say something about this. So yes, what we have seen in our work with companies and industry sectors, that child labor is always highest on the agenda because it's such a risk area, and it's such a reputational area for companies. The noises around child labor in a company's own operations or supply chains scare companies. So that is the area that they will try to address first. And quite often it remains with that issue. In our work with companies, we have always tried to emphasize that there's more than only child labor, and there's other children's rights issues. And I think the children's rights and business principles that were developed by Unicef, Save the Children, and the UN Global Compact, and launched a year after the UN Guiding Principles, so in 2012, are a very good entry point. They build on the UN Guiding Principles and take the same approach, but then focus on what children's rights impacts are. And these 10 principles actually look at issues such as parents and caregivers. They look at product quality, they look at marketing practices, they look at land and environment and how children can be differently impacted. They look at security arrangements. They also look at operations during humanitarian crisis, and they look at how companies can collaborate with governments and communities where they operate. So they provide a very holistic approach to children's rights beyond only child labor. They also include, by the way, one principle on child labor. So I would say that that is really a way to raise awareness about children's rights issues more broadly to companies beyond child labor.
I'm looking to Maria Pia because I know that UNICEF UK has launched a report on the issue. I don't know if you want to add something on the question.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Tulika, like looking at more, the child rights and business principles gives you a very good overview of the various impacts on how the companies might touch on it. And they're really wide ranging. They start from the child labor to the environment, disasters and humanitarian crises. So, looking back at what we were talking about at the beginning, like it's looking at the wider impact, so looking at how the company does impact on the various rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and then the prioritization as well. So prioritizing in terms of saliency will help a company to identify what are the key areas that they need to prioritize, but also looking also how the company can progress. And so while it might be as a first step, the company might prioritize few actions, in the course of the time, they might want to expand on it. And obviously, due diligence is something that is ongoing. So there needs to be enough flexibility to allow to assess the different contexts, but also, looking at the connection between, how does impacts on the environment have an impact on other groups. So as a company, if you are operating in an area, in a country where there is water scarcity, for example, are you contributing to that water scarcity with your actions? Because that will have quite clear impacts on communities and children as well. So it's really going beyond just the immediate risk for companies, but also looking at the broader impacts, the broader context, and ideally also look how can you have a positive impact in society as well.
Thank you, Maria Pia. So I'm going through the next question. what is the relevance of the recognition of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and human rights for children's rights? I will ask John to ask this question because you have talked on the issue. I think you could add something to this question, please, John.
Yeah, I think it was really good news that the Human Rights Council acknowledged this as a human right, because we rightly focus a lot on climate, but we don't focus enough on the other environmental issues, and biodiversity, healthy, clean environment have big impacts on future generations and big impacts on children today. I gave the example of clean air in my earlier intervention. So, I mean, that I think is a very concrete and tangible example, but there are many others to do with health. I mean, I suppose I'll just re-emphasize the issue of mental health, which I did touch on in my first comments about, you know, this again, I mean, all over the world, children have suffered during the past 2 years of lockdown, not just the absence of education, which is really important. It's the absence of socialization as well, has had a big effect. And it has meant that the dark side of the internet and social media has really impacted on the mental health of many teenagers in many parts of it. I mean, not just in the developed world, in the global south too. I think it's a, and I think the depth of it is only just being understood now, in terms of the mental health crisis, eating disorders, identity issues, the reinforcement of stereotypical views, the opposite of intersectionality, if we want to go back to the beginning. And a final reflection, it's not really on healthy environment, but is on the right to education. Whilst we've made good progress, I think, in terms of getting kids into school, and I, you know, Malala, the Nobel Prize winner, in particular, girls' education, etc. I mean, something that Malala says, and I think is, you know, others say too, it's not just about getting people into schools, it's what they're taught when they're there. And the worrying thing, I guess, is freedom of speech, freedom of thought is really under challenge in many parts of the world at the moment. In schools and outside of schools. So it's not just about the right to education. It's about, well, the right to education is not just about getting into a school. It is about what you're taught and the freedoms you have when you're there and the protections you have when you're there. So, you know, again, maybe that's moving us a little away from the business nexus, because you can't maybe blame businesses too much for that. But certainly the role of social media and the businesses involved in social media has really framed a lot of the way that young people enjoy their rights or don't enjoy their rights at the moment.
Thank you, John. Jump on the relevance of the right to a healthy environment. So earlier this year, Unicef has published the Children's Climate Risk, Children's Climate Risk Index, and it is the first comprehensive overview of what is, you know, climate change, environmental degradation risk from a child rights perspective. What does that mean? What is the impact on children? I think, you know, as John was saying, it's not only about climate change, it's also the environmental degradation of what it means for children as well. I think, you know, it is really important, the recognition, because, you know, it concurs to the idea that you also need to consider what is the impact on the environment and recognize it that an impact on environment is an impact on human rights, and that will have, you know, dire consequences. And, you know, the index essentially created, you know, is packed with data. But what came up is that over 1/3 of all children in the world now live in countries where they are exposed to 4 or more overlapping climate and environmental shocks. And they, you know, and these are shocks that are significant for children because they have an impact on their capacity, on their rights, but also their capacity to develop. And also, often in some countries, the environmental impacts and climate change impacts are combined with a lack of access to adequate services, which therefore increase the risk of children to be able to be resilient to this crisis. And so I think it's really important to that one also to take that into account, to really like start connecting these two areas of work. And while it is true that there is a lot to unpack about the intergenerational aspect of climate change when it comes to business and human rights. One of the things also that we need to consider is that some people are experiencing the effects, the impacts of climate change right now. And some of those people are children. And I think that is quite important to also look into that, because these impacts are happening now on children. It means that they might deprive them of opportunities in the future for their development. And that is something that we need to take into account, how impacts right now will have an impact on their future opportunities. So for example, climate change, environmental disasters disrupt education. And when children do not have access to education or quality education, obviously this has an impact on their future opportunities of growth, of career, and development as well. I think that is also something important to keep in mind in this conversation.
Thank you, Maria Pia. I'm going to the next question. I would like to put this question in a broader terms. How can Portuguese consumers know if they are buying a product free of labor, child labor? I think we can think about not specifically Portuguese consumer, but thinking about the European Union consumers. How can the European Union consumers know if they are buying products free of child labor? I don't know. John, yes.
I can have a go at that. When I used to work for a company 20 years ago, the Body Shop International, and the CEO there, Anita Roddick, and she used to say, she used to stand up and say, we have child labor in our supply chain. That was the first thing she'd always say. And then she would talk about how endemic child labor is in Asia and Africa and actually parts of Europe, etc. And the distinction between child labor and the worst forms of child labor. And it was certainly true 20 years ago that in virtually every international business sector, if you looked enough tiers down, and particularly in the informal sectors, you would find child labor. And I think that's probably still true now. It's not always the worst forms of child labor. It doesn't mean that the right to education is undermined, but there's still child labor to be found. So I still think the issue for consumers is not to set up some expectation that there isn't child labor in global supply chains. There is. There's forced labor in global supply chains too. Is what you do about it. And, I think in the 90s and the noughties, companies, Gap and others, became quite progressive. I think when they found child labor in suppliers, they didn't automatically drop suppliers and push workers into worst forms of child labor, but actually worked on remedial measures. I think we've made some progress, but I also, I just think the question has to be framed in the right way. Distinctions between different forms of child labor, certainly the worst forms of child labor, have to stop immediately, but also don't set up an expectation that global supply chains are clean. I don't think, we developed the corporate human rights benchmark a few years ago that ranks 330 of the world's largest companies on including child labor and human rights indicators. There are human rights issues in the supply chains of every global company. And I think if you looked hard enough, you'd find child labor in the supply chain of just about every global company. The question isn't, is it there? The question is, what are you doing about it? I think it's, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to the next question from...
I think Tulika wants to come in there.
I saw her hand there.
No worries. I just wanted to add an example of a Dutch company. It's a chocolate company that you may be aware of. It's called Tony Chocolonely, and they tried to put a chocolate bar on the market that is child labor and slave labor free, but then at the beginning of their journey, they realized very soon that you cannot for the full 100% guarantee that it is that. So they changed their way of communicating as well, that they're striving towards or aiming to be child labor and slave labor free. And I think that links up to what John said, that I think companies should demonstrate and show their efforts. But I think it's very hard for a company to be completely child labor free. And those companies that pretend that they are, I think they need to really be able to prove with hard evidence that they actually don't have child labor.
Okay, Maria Pia.
Yes, I definitely like one quick thought when it comes about child labor in supply chains is looking at the importance not only of remedial measures but prevention as well from companies as well, because what we want to make sure is that this does not happen, and therefore making sure that companies know where the risks are and they're taking preventative measures is really really important, rather than only focusing instead on remediation of child labor, which obviously is quite important, but it needs to be still thought into the best interest of the child as well. So I think it is important to also talk about not only remediation but also prevention of child labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Pia. So I move on to the next question from Sabrina Rao. What do you believe the most important aspects to be for the protection of children's rights related to and use of business products and service, such as digital products and service? Do you believe consultation with children in design and develop of new technology is feasible?
I can have a go at that. Yeah, well, it happens all the time. I mean, whenever they're designing a computer game, they consult with children, right? So if you can consult with children around the design of a computer game, you can consult with children around child protection measures online as well. It's just a question of how it's done. And I've seen Microsoft and others do it. We had a few years ago, we embedded a colleague with Microsoft for a couple of weeks to watch how they looked at online hate on a number of their gaming platforms, Xbox, and how they monitored and intervened on hate messages that children were sending each other through sort of chat functions. So yeah, it's definitely possible, and I think you can also involve children. If you involve children in the design of the games, I think you can also involve children in some questions around technology more generally. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John. Tulika, you have something?
I just wanted to add that I think it's also important that the voices of those that have become victim of online exploitation or bullying, etc., are taken into consideration. For example, as an example, a company like Facebook, where children can be affected in many different ways, from being sold as child brides to being exposed to bullying, to abduction, all kinds of things. I think only by knowing those stories as a social media platform can you improve and make your platforms more aware and prevent those things from happening in the future. So yes, consulting children, I think, is very important, but also listening and taking the voices of those that have been affected into account to improve the platforms or products that they put on the market.
Thank you, Tulika. Maria Pia?
Yes, and adding a quick point in this, consulting with children is definitely important, and hearing their views and their experiences it is critical that it is done in a way that is safe and respectful for them and meaningful for them as well. So it must be, it's not only about safety, but also being meaningful. It means that their views actually are acted upon. And I think that is something that is critical when we're talking about, consulting with children in any area, and also specifically when companies want to consult with children as well.
Thank you, Maria. I move forward to another question, also from Sabrina Rao. In regard to consultations with children, providing them a platform to voice their concerns, what is the role of consent and parental consent in this context? In the digital context, what my grievance mechanism that is accessible to children look like in regard to consent and their data rights? So, John, can you?
I was hoping you weren't going to pick on me this time, Odete, because it's quite a technical. It's well beyond my area of expertise. That I think maybe Maria Pia is better.
Maria, is there anything?
Yeah, I was reading it again. It's a really technical question. And my suggestion is that Unicef has developed a whole set of papers specifically on children's digital rights. So I think it would be good to look into that in that area, specifically in terms of data protection. We're definitely there has been quite a lot of resources being developed in that area. But again, grievance mechanism that is accessible to children, that is one of the key areas. Children need to know that they have a right to make a complaint, and they need to be able to access it in an easy way and in a way that it is understandable for them. So this is something that it needs to be taught in the design phase already. It's not an afterthought, but when these mechanisms are taught, so they need to be think as a way as the end user, and therefore what will make it really accessible, what will make children know about this mechanism as well. That is the key areas.
Thank you, Maria Pia. I have a question for you directly, because it's about from Mariana Ferreira, from your earlier intervention, that it says, thank you very much for your intervention, Mrs. Pia Bianchetti. What exactly do you mean by increasing the resilience of children?
I thought I mentioned resilience of children when I mentioned about climate change and environmental degradation impacts, and it is essentially the capacity of children to respond to respond to this environmental degradation and return to their to environmental hazards, and to return to their lives. So that was in the concept of climate change and environmental impacts.
Thank you, Maria Pia. I know that Tulika wants to intervene.
Yes, I just wanted to build on what Maria Pia said in the previous question.
Oh, okay.
It related to another tool from UNICEF, which I think might be useful. It's about engaging on children's rights by businesses, and it gives guidance on how companies can engage with those that represent children and children themselves, and give sort of tools and suggestions on how to do it in a child-friendly manner. So that might be useful for Sabrina as well, and others.
Yeah, thank you. It's very useful. Thank you for bringing that. John?
Yeah, just while we're still on that point on technology, before we move on, I don't want it just to be left at the question of data. I think data is a huge part of it, but algorithms, right? We know certain algorithms drive extremism, hatred, misinformation, but also child abuse. So the design of algorithms is not a neutral thing. Tech companies have to understand that when they design these algorithms, they have to have child protection in mind. And then also apps, right? A lot of discussion at the moment around Facebook and Instagram and anorexia and the role of filters, right? That distort and change body image online. This stuff can be very damaging on young people. I mean, there needs to be a lot more of a conversation, I think, about, you know, the different apps that are developed and the human rights impact of them. Not that they need to be banned necessarily, but there needs to be more of a discussion. So I just wanted to say it's data protection is a big part of it, but it's not just about data.
Thank you, John. Just two more questions. Also from Dominique Schmitz. What is the most pressing access to justice issue in the EU mandatory human rights due diligence legislation should include? I don't know.
I'm going to be controversial here and say
it's good.
Yeah,
it's
no,
good
I know. I
discussion.
mean, everyone talks about mandatory due diligence, and I think it's really important. But don't raise your expectations that this is going to solve everything. I mean, the French law has become a bit of a tick-boxing exercise. The German law will probably be better. We don't know yet. But, you know, due diligence, you know, is the pillar 2 of the UNGPs. The remedy is pillar 3. Remedy should, there clearly needs to be reference to remedy in due diligence, but it's a different function. Remedy deserves its own focus, and it's you know, as apart from due diligence. Due diligence is about minimizing risk and preventing and mitigating, but bad things can still happen even after good due diligence. So we need to talk about remedy in all its forms, judicial and non-judicial, but not just through the lens of mandatory due diligence. You know, I think the ability, and the French law requires on civil action by NGOs. I believe the German law will give the state a bit more of a proactive role in terms of administrative law, in terms of taking action. So I think anything that doesn't just leave it to NGOs, right, to have to take legal action on companies, it's good that the state takes some responsibility for that. But most issues relating to children should be criminal law issues. You know, these need to be serious legal child protection issues. We shouldn't be leaving the welfare of our children up to NGOs to in the context of mandatory due diligence, in my view. Yeah.
Thank you, John. And the last question is from Monica Silva. How can we mobilize citizens to advocacy process at the EU level on this issue? I'm looking to Maria Pia this time.
I think, you know, the public as an impressive power to tell essentially legislator what they want to do and what they think it is important. So engaging with the process is about finding a ways of you can express what you think it is important. So there are a lot of NGOs that are working on, for example, on petitions as well, or on lobbying, for example, at the EU level as well. So that this is, it is about funding, you know, the right way and what are the right way to engage with the process. But it's definitely something that that it is important for this process to deliver the expected outcomes definitely.
Thank you. Tuli, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I don't have anything particular to add to this question. It goes a little bit beyond my expertise.
Okay, thank you.
Odete, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute, Odete. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think we conclude the questions on the Q and answer chat box. So before closing this session, this webinar, I would like to ask our three speakers, John, Tulika, Maria Pia, if they have anything to add, a short comment to this issue on business and children's rights. I start with Tulika this time.
Sure. Thank you, Odete. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you and as a moderator and for the organizers of this webinar. I think it's an important topic, and I think we don't hear enough about children's rights and business beyond the people that already work in this space. So it's always the usual players like Unicef, ILO, working on child labor. And I still think that the topic of children's rights is not well embedded into companies' operations beyond child labor. So I'm very glad that this event took place. I hope that it will be widely disseminated, that the recording will be seen by companies, by people working on the topic, and that we will have a follow-up to this, and that we will see, as mandatory human rights diligence comes into force, that children's rights are considered in those processes. Thank you.
And Maria Pia.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for the webinar. It's really interesting, and it was great being with this panelist and creating a space to talk about child rights more broadly and in due diligence. I think a few thoughts is to remember that children's rights are human rights, and which means that they need to be embedded from the governance to the business strategy to the to the due diligence and to the remediation. I think the key reminder is that children's rights are human rights, and that needs to be embedded throughout the life of a company.
Thank you, Maria Pia. And John?
Yeah, maybe I'll end with a big picture note. It's not an easy time to be a kid, right? The world is not going in the right direction. We talked about the failings of COP26. Most of the children of the future are going to be in Asia, in Africa particularly, less so in Europe and North America. What are we doing now for those children in terms of their lives, their livelihoods, their jobs, their business and human rights, if you like, when they're facing climate change, forced migration, and the lack of livelihoods? I think this is it's not a small issue. It is probably the biggest issue in some ways in business and human rights terms, if you think about the role of work and business going forward. So I really want to thank Claire and everybody and yourself for organizing this today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So thank you all of three, John, Maria Pia, and Tulika, for this very interesting and enlightening discussion. It was really, really great. Thank you. So just to conclude, a final word as a chair of this webinar, which is related to the question of our webinar, but where do children fit? As we discussed today, only an effective law mandating human rights and environment due diligence that integrates children's rights and provides access to justice will clarify business responsibility, reward those who are taking action to uphold their rights responsibilities, and sanctions those who abuse children's rights and harm the environment. It is important to stress that children are 1/3 of the world's population and thus play an important role in the global economy, but they are also one of the most vulnerable groups exposed to negative impacts from the business. As stated by the former special representative of the UN Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, Professor John Reggie, who passed away recently, quote, "Children are among the most marginalized and vulnerable members of the society and can be disproportionately, severely, and permanently impacted by the business activities, operation, and relationships," unquote. I'm now, I want to thank all of the participants, the speakers. I hope that that you found this session as interesting as I have. Again, I would like to thank our guest speakers for joining us today. Please be sure to join us for the next webinar at 4 o'clock. Today, the topic is corporate due diligence and the digital transformation. It has been an honor and a pleasure sharing this first webinar. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for this opportunity and to bring this issue to the discussion on this first annual conference on human rights. And thank you for your courage to bring this issue to this first annual conference. And I say goodbye to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Odete, and thank you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.